We are barreling into the very final session, and it's a short one. We have a very short conversation coming up with Professor John List.
Exact. I am delighted to introduce a mentor and a friend of the BVA family, Professor John List. John is not only a giant in the field of behavioral science and field experimentation, but he is also one of the most experienced applied behavioral scientists. John is, for sure, very well known in the academic world. He is a Kenneth Griffin Distinguished Service Professor in Economics at the University of Chicago. Hello, John.
Hello, guys. How you doing?
Very well, thank you. I was introducing you. And it's quite long.
No. You're way too kind. Let's get down to business, Eric and Ted.
Let's do it.
He has co-authored over 20 peer-reviewed journal articles and published 2 international bestsellers, The Y-Axis and last year The Voltage Effect. Both we strongly recommend. Kastenstein has said of John List, he has done more than anyone else to advance the methods and practice of field experiments. I stop there, but John is also a successful practitioner as the previous chief economist at Uber, at Lyft, and now at Walmart. Welcome, John.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored to be part of this great event, and let's get down to business.
Let's do it. John, you are the capstone. You are the big finale. So today, I know we've talked to you about your books. The last time we talked about the voltage effect. This time, I really want to talk about putting behavioral science into practice. So take off professor hat, take off author hat, and really think about your time when you're in organizations helping business leaders to apply behavioral science. So my first question is kind of a fundamental one. Why do you think it's important for leaders and organizations to apply behavioral science to their business?
Yeah. No, look, that is the fundamental question, and the answer is pretty simple, because it works. And we know it works from various venues, various contexts, various situations. No, look, back in the 80s and 90s, I think it's fair to say behavioral science was an academic curiosity. But I think since that time, in governmental settings and firm settings, in nonprofit settings, in the Petri dish, wherever, behavioral science is tried and true. And we have learned quite a bit over the last several decades. Now, the other more practical point is that within organizations, we make decisions all the time to do new things. So what I would always propose is try a few things that are standard, try to find a few things that are more behavioral, and give it a test, because every day that goes by that you're not testing what works, that's another day that you don't really understand how to make your organization better, whether it's to make your employees better, make your customers better, make the profits better, whatever it might be. Every day, these types of things will work, and they can work at scale.
Yeah. John, one of the challenges that I find is that I agree with what you say, and I think for those of us who kind of understand behavioral science, we get that. What I think we find sometimes with our clients is we say, look at this example, it's really interesting, and it worked in personal lending at a bank. And they say, but I'm not a bank, I'm insurance. Or we say, look at this, we did this with somebody and they got people to do laundry in a more efficient way. And they say, oh, but I make a food product, so it's not the same. That, what we try to impress upon them is about human behavior. But they sometimes are caught up in their sector or in their category. Now, you went from Uber to Lyft, pretty connected categories, but then you've made the move to Walmart. So how do you transition and create that belief in a different business, in a different context? Any strong examples?
Yeah, so look, when I was at Uber, I had a bad trip from my home to downtown Chicago. And I realized that I was not only angry, but I became incensed when I did not receive an apology from the company. Okay. So I went to Travis Kalanick, founder, and back then he was the CEO of Uber. This is when I was the chief economist there. And I said, you know what, Travis, I received this bad trip and I never received an apology. And he said, well, we haven't gotten around to it yet. And I said, well, we have now. So what did I do? The first step is to use behavioral science to figure out what is the effect of bad trips on the business. And as it turns out, it's 100 millions, millions of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars every 6 or 12 months across America. And then came the job to use behavioral insights to design a few different approaches to apologies that would really help us, let's say, gain the trust back from customers and gain their business. So we did that. We did that in a series of experiments. And now we've developed a product there called Uber Apologies. We then took that to Uber Eats. It worked there. We then took it to Lyft when I moved to Lyft, and it worked there. And now we're actually doing it in our online pickup and delivery business at Walmart. So that's a type of finding, a little bit like defaults. People view losses very differently than gains. People want you to restore trust. These are fundamental findings that will likely generalize. Now, the critics are right. In many cases, there are important moderators that moderate these types of effects, but that doesn't mean that the main effect will be absent. We still have a main effect, but we will have certain moderators. Now, you can use that example back at Uber when we introduced tipping. It was the same issue. Then we did tipping at Lyft, and now we do tipping at Walmart. When you think about loyalty programs, I worked on those at Uber and Lyft and now Walmart. I'm also working on a project called Project Gigaton at Walmart, which is trying to take a gigaton of CO2 emissions per year out of our supply chain.
Wow.
All of these rely on insights from behavioral science that will for sure not generalize whole cloth, but the general sentiment of them, like defaults or like losses versus gains, those types of results do generalize relatively fluidly.
And do you find that the context, my background, I come from a shopper behavior background, so, your time at Walmart I find specifically interesting. To your point, the fundamentals of defaults and losses versus gains, but how about that context? Are you experimenting? How are you understanding, a loyalty program at Walmart, of course, is very different than a loyalty program at Uber or Lyft, or an apology from Walmart, I assume, is for very different reasons and sounds very different than an apology from Uber or Lyft. Anything there on kind of the context of how you deliver?
Yeah, no, look, 100%. So when I think about generalizability, I think about it in basically two big bins. The first bin is the properties of the population. So this is a population of people who I am treating or who's in my behavioral science experiment. That will matter, and many times it will matter in predictable ways that economics gives us insights as well, and psychology does, and sociology does as well. But alongside that, you have another bin that I would call properties of the situation. It's what a lot of people call context. These are situational features that are many times unique, but oftentimes they are also shared across domains. So when I think about generalizing insights, whether it's to scale or whether it's simply to go from one environment to another, I think about predictably how will the population of people change the results, and also how will the properties of the situation change the results. Now, what I found, and I've worked on this now for 25 or 30 years, the typical finding is that even small perturbations in the situation are much more important than changes in the population of people. So I think as we gain more experience with situations and more experience with the types of features that really matter to behaviors, I think then we will begin to start to think about behavioral laws. So in economics, we have the law of demand.
Yeah.
That works most of the time. But when we start thinking about different laws, they will likely involve contextual features that we find are important. And this is a burgeoning science right now about external validity and generalizability.
You just barely mentioned scale there, and you know, your recent book last year that we talked about, The Voltage Effect, was all about scale. Somewhat related to that, I think we've had a lot of questions from the audience today on different topics about return on investment. When you apply behavioral science, how do you get a return on investment? And I think quite linked to that, of course, is scale. What's your perspective about the challenge for behavioral science interventions to reach scale within a large organization, as this can be, you know, a big pushback from the business? It might be a great idea, but how do we scale it, and what will be that impact?
No, I think that's a great point. So, in a way, behavioral scientists have been pigeonholed in a very unfair manner, because remember, where this all starts is a theory or empirical results from the Petri dish that are meant to test that theory, and they were never meant to scale per se. So people say, well, look, it worked in that little domain or that little part of the world, but it won't work in my part of the world or in other more general parts of the world. To be fair to behavioral scientists, we were never really pushed in that direction. And in academia, we tend to be rewarded for finding, does a theory work in our particular setting, because we think the theory will be general. Now, as we begin to think about, will that intervention or will that behavioral insight scale, that presents us with an entirely different type of research approach, which I talk about in the voltage effect. If your main concern is, I want to create an idea that will scale, we fundamentally have to look at the data generating process and the knowledge creation process differently from the very beginning. It's what I talk about, how we need to backward induct to explore what are the features or the constraints that our idea will face at scale. And we want to test those in the Petri dish. So then we're not only learning, does the general idea work in its best case scenario? That's typically what we do as scientists, is we do efficacy tests, but to also test the boundary conditions in the initial setting. And in that world, once we start to do that, I think more and more people will see, you know what, it not only works in its best light, but it also works in other more demanding environments. Now, just a few examples. I wrote a paper a few years ago called the $100 Million Nudge. And that was an experiment in which I worked, a group and I worked with the Dominican Republic government to try to explore how simple nudges that we learn about in the Petri dish, how do they work across the entire tax base? And of course, it worked quite well. That's why it's called the $100 Million Nudge. When you look at our work at Uber, our work there is around the world. When you look at it at Walmart, same thing. When we worked with Virgin Atlantic, same thing. Small nudges across their entire fleet ends up saving, over an 8 or 10 week period, 25 million tons of CO2 emissions, and it helps them $10-15 million in fuel savings. So the nice thing about large organizations and scale is that even small nudges that give you a little bit, when they scale, they tend to give you a lot, just because of the aggregation that's going in your favor. So I think as we begin to think more and more about those issues, behavioral science will become more and more important, not less and less important.
Great. John, we've been talking to practitioners in lots of different sectors throughout the day, from gambling to pharma to retailing to fast-moving consumer goods to transport. You know, do you have any recommendations for organizations to make sure that they're ethical in the way that they utilize behavioral science and the way in which they experiment?
Yeah, you know, I'm so glad that you brought that up, because that is one of the most important issues that a lot of times it ends up being on the sidelines. As it turns out, I'm writing a textbook on experimental economics, or experimentation in the social sciences, and a chapter in that book is labeled The Ethics of Economic Experiments. And that chapter, as it turns out, is by far the largest single chapter in the book. And I start to think about ethics as coming into play in three specific areas. One is in simple reporting. Are we reporting the results faithfully and ethically? Are we reporting our conflicts of interest? And then it goes to things like data governance and management. That also falls under the tent of ethics, and we should make sure we do well in the governance and management. But a lot of times, what people tend to talk about is when researchers and subjects or innocent bystanders have conflicting interests. And in those cases, many times we have this decision about which route do we want to take. My concern there is we want to make sure that when we run behavioral science interventions, first of all, we have what I would call clinical equipoise, and that's that we truly don't know what's going to happen. That's why we're randomizing people into treatment or treatment arms or control groups. But also that in expectations, each participant in our experiments are made better off. Now, that kind of thinking goes beyond the Belmont report. It goes beyond the common rule. But I think as behavioral scientists, we always want to be very careful on the ethical front and make sure that our subjects are better off for being one of our subjects in our experiments. But I think when it comes to ethical considerations, this is going to become more and more important. Nobody wants to be experimented on. And people feel violated, but if we can make them better off from doing so, I think we're on a lot stronger and more permanent ethical grounds.
Great. Eric, I'll pass it to you for maybe a final question before we hop to the questions from the crowd.
Yes, John. If a leadership team or a leader of a big organization wants to infuse behavioral science learnings and method within the organization, there are big different ways. For example, to create a behavioral science team, or to train every employee in the organization, or to create champion expert in behavioral science in each main department, or maybe to instill a culture of experimentation, to create a critical thinking culture within the organization that I know is something very important for you. What is your perspective and your recommendation if I want to infuse behavioral science structurally in the organization? What is the best way to do it?
Yeah. Look, that's a great question. And I'm going to speak from my limited experience. I have been part of behavioral insights teams, the UK Behavioral Insights team, the Obama Behavioral Insights team, and others. I have been also in charge of changing culture in organizations, and that's very, very hard. I have also been embedded in organizations, and I've built teams that are within organizations that attempt to infuse behavioral insights. So I've sort of seen the gamut, and what I see working, at least in my particular experiences, is there's somebody who is an expert or a group of people who are experts in behavioral science. And they're actually embedded in the organization, and they're living and breathing and working with as part of an organization, because then you really get a feel for what is the culture like, what are the important questions, what are the obstacles or blockers, and that really helps you make proposals of ideas or behavioral interventions that you want to try. So I would say my first step is to think about creating a behavioral team of experts that is embedded, and alongside that, what I call a scaling team that is also embedded to try to add insights from the beginning on what are the features of the idea we need to learn about before we can think of scaling. So I'm a big proponent of an expert and a small team being embedded to actually help change the culture, but also learn about what can work and what the organization really needs. That's been the most effective approach that I've seen in my years of working with organizations, both for-profit and nonprofit firms.
John, I'm gonna kind of hit that question over the head to be a little bit more obvious, just because our our attendees, looking at the over 2,700 people who registered, we have some people right up at the top who are making kind of C-suite decisions, but we also have a lot of people who are a mid-level marketing manager. They are a brand manager. They're a UX strategist. They're a brand strategist. They're working in data and compliance. Do you think within an organization, there's a particular department or domain where embedding that specialist you've talked about can be that first kind of seed to kind of plant the growth of behavioral science in an organization?
Yeah, I mean, I want that person or team talking directly to the CEO and talking directly to other people who are making important decisions. I think you can always bury them in pricing or bury them in strategy or finance at some lower level, and that just won't work. I think you always need the team to not only have the gravitas of being able to talk directly to the decision makers, but also that goes down the other way as well. Sure. And you will have a lot more commitment to your cause, and you will have a lot more partnerships around the org if they know that you are speaking directly to the decision makers, and you will be able to affect change. If you can't affect change, or at least you're invested with key decision makers, I think it's a very, very difficult push.
Yeah. We have a question, our first question from the audience, John. This comes from Lorraine. She's watching online, and she said, you mentioned the savings and the benefit for the companies you've worked for. Can you also tell us about the impact on the employees, their quality of life, their happiness at work, et cetera? Any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Yeah, look, absolutely. So let's just take a few examples. One example is a gender pay gap paper that I worked on at Uber. So my first instinct when I was thinking about the driver pay at Uber is that, a lot of the traditional arguments for why women are paid less than men in formal labor markets are things like long hours of work, negotiating wages, et cetera, et cetera. And in the gig economy, a lot of those arguments are actually put on the shelf.
Yeah, fair.
So we did work with Uber when I was chief economist and explored what is the gender pay gap amongst drivers. And what we find is that women, even at Uber, are earning 7% less per hour than men. And when you unpeel that, you have elements like women tend to accept all trips that they're given where men strategically reject them. You have women learn at a different rate than men because they tend to be part-time drivers rather than full-time drivers. So we began to go in that system, especially when I went to Lyft, to set it up so that gender pay gap would lessen for our employees. Same kind of thing that when we did Virgin Atlantic Airways. So I gave you the example of how much money we saved Virgin Atlantic, and I gave you the fact about how much we saved for CO2 emissions. But what I left on the sidelines is we also explored the happiness of captains and the employee satisfaction of the captains. And this is written in the paper as well. And the employee satisfaction, the captain satisfaction with on the job was much higher because of our interventions as well. So that's another example of behavioral science, not only helping what you might say the owners or the environment, but it is also helping the captains who were in our particular experiment.
I think if I'm
Hopefully that's helpful, Lorraine, and thanks for listening in.
I think if I'm boarding a plane, I want my captain to be fairly happy, I think personally. John, is there, you've worked in public sector, you've worked on the tax side, you've worked with transport companies, you're working now with one of the biggest retailers in the world. Is there a sector or a domain that you're itching to have some sort of appointment or some sort of consultative role because you believe we can affect either internal behavior or customer behavior in a way that would really make you excited or really benefit the world in an exciting way?
Yeah, so that's a good question, but let me preface it by saying I'm super happy at Walmart and I'm super busy.
You're not looking around. We know. We're talking 10 years from now.
World.
Yeah.
Exactly. Let's take the counterfactual world.
Yeah.
If there was no Walmart, what am I looking for in an organization? I'm looking for partnerships that allow me to leverage the data that they have in hand or leverage data that we can actually generate to not only make the organization, the employees, the customers better off, but also leverage that data to take on big social problems. So we've had a paper that recently came out using Lyft data, and it's machine learning, AI type of approach to using Lyft data to take on the question of what I call in the crime literature the denominator problem. That typically we don't know the distribution of crimes that are committed across the different groups of people. But at Lyft, of course, we have people's phones, which is in the car, which tracks whether they're speeding or not. So now I have the distribution of crime types across the different groups, and I can see the probability of being arrested or pulled over when you speed, and then conditional on that speed, whether you get a ticket or not.
Okay.
Now I've solved the denominator problem in crime by having an academic partnership with a firm, with Lyft, and it takes on a very important social issue. So that's what I tend to look for, is you want to take on these problems where you can really change the world for the better, and you can lend insights that are in a very scientific way to try to move the literature and try to help people learn about what's happening in our world around us and to help combat these social problems, whether it's discrimination, whether it's gender pay gaps, whether it's climate change in that particular case, whether it was how law enforcement officers are treating individuals. I think all of these are, and more, of course, are fair game. So those are the features or characteristics that I look for in partnerships.
Excellent. We have a question, John, here from someone who's attending with us in person in Paris.
Hello, is this working? Can you hear me, John? I think it's going to take a couple of seconds.
May we have the mic on for the question?
Hello? Which one is it? Oh.
1 second, John. It's coming to you.
No problem.
We're switching out mics. There we go.
Hi there. Can you hear me, John?
Perfect.
Yes, I can hear you. Perfect.
Perfect. Nice to meet you. I'm Antoine. I work in Novartis where I lead behavioral and data science. And I just want to come back to the ethics question because I work in ethics, risk, and compliance. And I've been really thinking hard about the ethical and responsible use of behavioral science. And I was really intrigued by what you said about how do we make sure that people are better off. I just wanted to check your thinking. Having spent a bit of time thinking about that, I feel like finally that the ethical consideration with behavioral science have not much to do with behavioral science itself. What I mean by that is, I think it's easier to solve the behavioral science problem and the how, agreed consent, transparency, robustness of the findings. I think that's the easy thing to solve, how we do behavioral science. But I think the real ethical question has nothing to do with behavioral science for organization, which is more for which interest are we doing this? Is it aligned with just is it for the benefit of the industry or the organization? Or is it for the benefit of society? How do you feel about that? I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
No, I think you're right. Look, when you look at, the Belmont Report or the Helsinki work or the work since then, whether it's the Common Rule, etc., this is inherently a question that affects behavioral scientists, and it affects the way we can think about generating data. But it's a much bigger issue. This is about appropriate and ethical treatment of experimental subjects. When we run experiments or we even work with data from humans, we have a particular set of guidelines that we need to follow, and we should be very clear amongst our organizations and our cohort here about what's expected of each of us. But you're exactly right. This is an issue that is much, much bigger than behavioral science. This is an issue about your moral compass and our ethical codes of conduct. And that's exactly the way I wrote the chapter. I write the chapter in thinking about, the Nuremberg trials, the Belmont Report. There has been a lot of work that is outright abusive, whether it's Milgram experiments or whatever, of human subjects. And we should start to think about what have we learned from those and what type of ethical standard do we want to put forward is humans. Now, as behavioral scientists, of course, we're humans. But the way I think about it is I've developed a schematic, and I can send you the chapter. If you send me an email, I'd love to get your comments on it. But I have a gold standard, a silver standard, a bronze standard, and what I call a plutonium 239 standard. And that's really our ethical code, that as people who use data that can, let's say, give insights about other humans or how we treat those humans within the process of generating data or our behavioral science interventions, I think there should be certain standards that we follow and certain protocol that we can all agree on are appropriate uses of behavioral sciences. Now, this is where you went, which is the tension begins when it's a difference between if we zig, that helps the customer, and if we zag, it helps the firm, and if we do something different, it helps employees. And when you help one of them, it might be at the detriment of others. And this is a constant tension that as researchers we might have with our subjects. So I like to think about it as a Pareto rule in a way, that I only want to do stuff that doesn't make anyone worse off, but makes some people better off. So that would be a Pareto rule that I tend to want to follow, and that's what I would call a gold standard approach. You can't always do that because there are particular situations where you might be harming one group while helping another. Okay, so the way the Belmont Report and the Common Rule talk about those cases is we want to make sure that there's not undue harm caused on those groups. Now, in my own field experiments, I want to go beyond that and make sure if there is harm that they're compensated. And I tend to do that within the experiment. But I think those types of debates are still being had. And you have also debates about informed consent. And that's part of this. But when people hear informed consent, they end up conflating that with data privacy. These are two totally different issues. Data privacy, we can all agree on, whether you have informed consent or not. Informed consent is another type of process that is an altogether different basket of questions where, of course, data privacy should be whether we have informed consent or not. But my thinking right now has evolved into taking what's out there, whether it's the Belmont Report or the Common Rule or Helsinki, and saying, how can we do better as scientists? How can we do better as behavioral scientists or field experimentalists to make sure that we're walking the correct ethical standard? And I think in those cases, there are some gray areas, but nevertheless, it's important to have that discussion and see where we end up.
Great. Thanks so much, John. We loved having you for our last session. We've got to say goodbye to you in Chicago because here in Paris, we've been here since 8:30 in the morning, and it's now...
Oh, gosh.
It's now, I don't know what time. But thanks so much. So good to have you again this year, and we hope to talk to you soon. Thanks,
Eric
John.
and Ted, thanks so much. Guys, thanks so much for having me and community. You're doing great work. And if you ever should need anything, go through Eric and Ted. Check me out. I'll be glad to help you in any way possible. Thanks
Great.
Again.
Thanks,
and
John.
Wonderful conference.
See you.
Thanks
John.
for the public goods you guys are providing.
All right. See you.
Thanks, John.
So, we have come to the end. I feel it's time. Adrien feels it's time. Look at all the post-it notes. His hands are broken. We need to say a final thank you to all of our speakers, all of our panelists, all of our BVA team, communications team, everybody. It has been a big effort. We put this on for you because we want to make this free and available to everybody. We want to see you next year. And I leave the final word to you, Eric.
Yeah. For someone, Deborah, I would like to say obrigado.
Oh, okay. Deborah's online.
She's not my wife.
Thanks so much, everybody. We hope to see you next year. Be well. Sketch notes, videos coming from Adrian and the team over the next days and weeks. Thanks so much. Have a good one. Bye-bye.